And it's all in for this evening. The Rachel Maddow Show starts right now. Good evening, Rachel.
Good evening, Chris. Thanks, man. And thanks to you at home for joining us this hour. September 7th, 1986, the city of Spokane, Washington was hosting something called the Spokane Interstate Fair. And several government witnesses later testified that on the afternoon of that fair in 1986, a man wearing camouflage pants and army boots walked up to the cotton candy booth at the fair, along with his wife. They also had their baby with them and a diaper bag. The young man in camouflage attempted to buy some cotton candy with a $20 bill. Whoever was manning that cotton candy booth at the fair that day realized something was wrong, and somebody called the police. Turns out the $20 bill was both counterfeit and a bad enough counterfeit that whoever was working at the cotton candy booth could tell that it was a fake. The sheriff's deputy turned up, arrested the guy with the fake $20 bill, and it turns out that inside the diaper bag, he had another 59 counterfeit $20 bills. Turns out that couple arrested at that fair that day, back in 1986, they were members of the Aryan Nations. They were members of a neo-Nazi group that was very active in the Pacific Northwest at the time. The group was trying to create an all-white homeland for white people in that northwest corner of the country. When the other Aryan Nations guys heard about their friend and their comrade being arrested at the cotton candy stand at the fair trying to pass that fake $20 bill, federal prosecutors say two of the other Aryan Nations guys, when they heard their friend got arrested, they went to the guy's house. They went to the couple's home, and once they were there, they flushed down the toilet a bunch of leftover green printer's ink that they had used to make those counterfeit $20 bills. They also took the scraps of counterfeit paper that had been left over after they'd cut the bills, and they took the paper cutter itself. But one of those two Aryan Nations guys then freaked out. And he turned himself into the FBI and he said he wanted protection. The next day, the FBI raided the home of the other guy with whom he had flushed the printer's ink and cleared out the paper cutter and all the rest. In the other guy's home, the FBI found not only more counterfeit 20s, stacks and stacks of counterfeit $20 bills, they also found whole uncut sheets of counterfeit $20 bills. Tens of thousands of dollars worth had the counterfeits been any good. According to the FBI, they also found a sheet of steel that matched shrapnel from a bombing that had happened just 2 weeks earlier in northern Idaho. On September 15th, 1986, so about a week after the cotton candy incident, a bomb had gone off at the home of a local pastor in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. He had been helping lead opposition to the Aryan Nations and against their effort to try to take over that part of Idaho and the Northwest. The Reverend Bill Wasmuth of Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, he was not hurt in the bombing of his home, but the forensic evidence taken from the bomb that went off at his house, that forensic evidence did tie back to those counterfeit $20 bills, and they did tie them back to the Aryan Nations and to this whole network of white supremacists operating a complex ring of crimes aimed at attacking people who they hated and getting publicity for the white supremacist cause and stealing or even manufacturing money in order to help them do more of the same. The neo-Nazi group of that time called the Order, they're best known for having murdered this man, a Jewish talk show host named Alan Berg in Denver. But the Order was also known at the time both for counterfeiting and also for a series of bank robberies and armored car robberies that are thought to have netted the group more than $4 million over the span of just a few years in the mid-1980s. The Order used that money from those armed robberies to finance itself as a neo-Nazi organization, but also to funnel that money to other white supremacist groups. They were hoping they were building what would eventually be an Aryan white power movement strong enough to overthrow the entire U.S. government. And they handed out this booty, basically, stolen money in hundreds of thousands of dollar chunks to other white supremacist groups. And there had been some effective law enforcement tactics against these neo-Nazi and far-right groups operating in the Pacific Northwest at that time. I mean, the details about the cotton candy counterfeiter and the bombing in Coeur d'Alene, those came out during a successful federal prosecution that the FBI brought against the Order and the Aryan Nations in 1985. They brought him up on racketeering charges, and whole big chunks of those groups all went to jail all at once. In 1985, that was a successful prosecution that was brought in Seattle. But 2 years later, in 1987, the FBI tried to go for something much bigger with these neo-Nazi groups. They convinced a federal grand jury in Arkansas an all-white jury in Arkansas in trial, once it got to trial. They convinced this federal grand jury to indict 15 different leaders of white supremacist and neo-Nazi groups for sedition. Not for racketeering or counterfeiting or armed robbery, any of these other little things, for sedition, for trying to overthrow the United States government. It was a really, really, really big deal case at the time.
A 3-year federal investigation of white supremacy groups in this country today resulted in indictments against 15 key members. Some were charged in connection with the murder of Jewish talk show host Alan Berg 3 years ago in Denver. Other charges included planning to murder a judge and plotting to overthrow the government. NBC's Roger O'Neill has more.
Called Operation Clean Sweep by some, the Justice Department says today's arrest wipe out the white supremacist group known as the Aryan Nations, with all of its leaders either in jail or headed that way. The U.S. Attorney in Denver said today's action sends a message.
The message is that any radical group that uses violence to achieve their ends will be dealt with by the Department of Justice.
The government says the violence included murder, bank and armored car robberies, plotting to kill this man, federal Judge Franklin Waters of Arkansas, and the ultimate overthrow of the U.S. government. The white supremacists belong to various groups, the Aryan Nations, the Order, the Ku Klux Klan, and were, according to officials, anti-black, anti-Jewish, anti-government.
So that was in 1987. Really ambitious prosecution brought against all of those different white supremacist leaders. They're going after them for trying to overthrow the U.S. government. It's a sedition trial. Those charges brought in April 1987, and that's when that NBC Nightly News report was from, April 1987. By April 1988, it had all fallen apart.
In Fort Smith, Arkansas today, an all-white jury acquitted 13 members of a white supremacist group charged with conspiring to overthrow the government and to kill 2 federal officials.
The FBI and federal prosecutors tried to bring down basically the whole neo-Nazi and white supremacist movement in one fell swoop. They put 15 men on trial all at once for the most serious charges you can levy against American citizens, right? Sedition, plotting to overthrow the government. The feds went for it and they missed. And that had to be a huge disappointment, right? At least an embarrassing failure for the prosecutors and for the FBI agents who were involved in that big landmark case. But imagine if you were the informant in that case. Imagine if you were the rat. Imagine if you were the guy inside the white supremacist movement who the FBI flipped and convinced to testify against your old neo-Nazi pals for the big federal case. And then your old neo-Nazi pals who you just ratted out, they won the case. And that happened to a guy. That happened in that prosecution back in 1987 and 1988. When the Order was robbing banks and robbing armored cars to raise money for the neo-Nazi movement, they gave some of that money to groups like the Aryan Nations, to the cotton candy counterfeiters, right? They also gave some of that money to a group called the White Patriot Party. The guy who founded the White Patriot Party got flipped by the FBI, and in exchange for a more lenient sentence for himself, he testified against everybody else in that indictment. He explained how he had been given $200,000 in stolen money from the guy who founded the Order, and he testified about what he knew about other white supremacist groups getting money from the Order as well. And when the case collapsed and all these guys were acquitted, here's this guy who had testified against everybody else in the neo-Nazi movement in open court. He had founded the White Patriots Party in North Carolina. He had founded the Carolina Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. But after that trial and after him turning state's evidence and ratting on all of his old colleagues in the neo-Nazi movement, he left North Carolina. He fled the state, he moved to Missouri, and he changed his name. He changed his name from Fraser Glenn Miller Jr. to Fraser Glenn Cross. And this weekend was Fraser Glenn Cross.
Panic and fear ripped through the parking lot of the Jewish Community Center this afternoon at 115th and Knoll.
There's a guy with a rifle here shooting at people.
So would you leave?
I would leave.
Is he still here?
I don't know.
3 are dead and a 14-year-old boy is in critical condition after police confirmed to 41 Action News a gunman opened fire in 2 different locations. Just after 1 o'clock, a man with a rifle shot at people in the parking lot, forcing the center into a lockdown. Dozens of people, including teens and children, scrambled to safety. Moments later, gunfire was also reported at Village Shalom, an assisted living facility a few blocks away at 123rd and Knoll.
Now, our cameras were there as that person was placed inside a police unit. Now, listen to what the suspect had to say.
The three people who were killed this weekend in that shooting in the Kansas City suburbs were a 69-year-old grandfather named William Corporon and his 14-year-old grandson, Reet Underwood, as well as a 53-year-old woman named Terry Lamano. Even though the suspects in these shootings was taken into custody almost immediately after the shootings happened, that was him in the back of the car shouting Heil Hitler, right? There was still some confusion as to his identity immediately after the shootings, I think in part because of his multiple aliases. And we know that those multiple aliases spring in part from the fact that he had to move across the country and pretend he was somebody else after he turned state's evidence against other neo-Nazis in that big failed sedition trial back in the late 1980s. Even so, though, he wasn't exactly hiding his white supremacist light under a bushel all these years. He did numerous press interviews over the years. And the Idaho Spokesman Review newspaper reports today that over the past 10 years, he has posted well over 10,000 messages to racist websites and message boards online. And these online message boards are an important part of how the neo-Nazi and white supremacist movements promulgate themselves still to this day and how they organize and hold themselves together. You might remember that the racist website Stormfront was the online home for this guy who opened fire inside a Sikh temple in Oak Creek, Wisconsin 2 years ago, killing 6 people before he killed himself. Stormfront was also the home base online for this guy who ambushed and killed 3 police officers with his AK-47 in Pittsburgh in 2009. The favorite online home for a man who called himself online Rounder, who offline was sometimes known as Fraser Glenn Miller or sometimes known as Fraser Glenn Cross. His online home is a place called Vanguard News Network. If you don't tend to keep Nazi networking hubs in your head, the reason this Vanguard group might sound familiar is because of this news story you might remember. This was the Martin Luther King Day parade in Spokane, Washington in 2011. A 36-year-old white supremacist packed fishing weights and other shrapnel dipped into rat poison into a backpack bomb, and he left it on the scene of the Martin Luther King Day parade in Spokane in 2011. He pled guilty later that year. He was sentenced to 32 years in prison. Part of what prosecutors used to try to influence the judge in his case to lengthen his sentence is that after he was arrested in Spokane, once he was in jail on suspicion of having been the bomber of the Martin Luther King Day parade, that confessed bomber from jail exchanged letters with the guy who shot up the 2 Jewish facilities and killed those 3 people this weekend in Kansas City. Fraser Glenn Cross wrote to the MLK Day bomber and offered to be a character witness for him after the bombing. He offered to set up a legal defense fund for him. He did media interviews about the MLK Day bomber's case, telling Talking Points memo at the time, quote, "I've been conversing with him on the internet for years. He contributed to my internet project. He sent me hundreds of dollars to help with that. I had a very strong opinion of his intellect," he said, and most of the other people did too on our Vanguard News Network forum. So the guy doing 32 years in prison for bombing the MLK Day parade in Spokane 3 years ago, and the guy who yelled Heil Hitler after allegedly shooting up those 2 Jewish facilities in Kansas City this weekend, they apparently were old friends who had been corresponding online for years at a neo-Nazi online hub. And it's not just them. The Spokesman Review also reports today that on Saturday, on the day before the Kansas City shootings this weekend, Fraser Glenn Miller, a.k.a. Fraser Glenn Cross, he was online, again this time, posting a public notice that he had just spoken with this guy. Over the past few months, you've probably seen one of the many inflammatory news stories that have been done about tiny, beleaguered Leith, North Dakota. This is this little town in North Dakota of 15 people where a small group of white supremacists moved in. They attempted to basically set up homesteads and take over the town. The town of Leith at one point considered disbanding itself so as to stop these Nazis from having anything to take over. Well, the leader of that pitiful white supremacist band in Leith, North Dakota, is named Craig Cobb. He's currently in jail facing 7 charges, including terrorizing the town officials in Leith. But from jail, he reportedly had contact on Saturday with the guy who on Sunday went on to do those Kansas City shootings. In 2009, the Department of Homeland Security prepared a draft report on the national security threat of homegrown right-wing extremists in the United States. After a draft of the report was leaked, there was a huge backlash on the political right and on the Fox News channel in particular. A huge backlash against the Department of Homeland Security, even studying the possibility that there might be a threat of violence from right-wing extremists in this country. That final report was never released. The lead author of the report later said that in response to the uproar, the Department of Homeland Security not only didn't release the report, they also diverted resources away from even studying the problem of homegrown right-wing extremists and their threat of violence. Today's the one-year anniversary of the bombing at the finish line of the Boston Marathon. One of the two suspects in that bombing, of course, is dead. The other one is in custody, still awaiting trial. From what's been made public about that case so far, it appears clear that the bombing at least seems to have been motivated in part by religious extremism. There are reports that the surviving suspect told people from the hospital when he was recovering from his wounds that he hoped to inspire other people to commit jihad. But there also seem to have been some other things going on here as well. The Wall Street Journal reporting several months ago that one of their reporters went into the apartment of the older suspect. And among the items found in the older suspect's apartment was a stack of right-wing conspiracy theory newsletters. The American Free Press, which promises to tell you the truth that the mainstream media will not tell you about black mob violence continuing unabated in America. The IRS scandal reveals that there's Jewish control at the White House. The Sovereign, which calls itself the newspaper of the resistance, reporting on how 9/11 was an inside job. Israeli lobbyists control the U.S. government. This is called the First Freedom, Equal Rights for Whites, which until recently was advertising events for Stormfront, the same Nazi message board frequented by the Sikh temple shooter and the Pittsburgh police ambush shooter with the AK-47. Stormfront, of course, the online cousin to the Vanguard News Network, home of the Martin Luther King Day bomber from Spokane and the alleged Kansas City, Kansas shooter this weekend. And you know, with the Boston bombing guy, how weird is it to have Chechen-speaking Russian immigrant Muslim guys reading 9/11 truther conspiracies and ads for Nazi message boards while also espousing violent jihad and allegedly setting off bombs that killed Americans? How weird is that combination of conspiratorial nihilism? Good question. But that is as much a part of the story of the Boston bombings as anything else that we have absorbed about the threat posed by those kinds of perpetrators in this past year. The New America Foundation tracks deadly, ideologically motivated attacks inside the United States since 9/11. Following the Kansas City attacks this weekend, their totals stand at 21 for the total number of people killed by attacks motivated by Islamic extremism. That includes the Boston Marathon bombing, with 4 people killed a year ago today. Also includes the Fort Hood shooting in 2009 with 13 people killed. But after the Kansas City shootings this weekend, the total number of people killed in what appear to be ideologically motivated attacks, not by jihadists, but by right-wingers in this country, that is a higher number. That's 34. Not 21, 34. And we have decided that combating terrorist attacks motivated by Islamic extremism is not only a matter of national significance, it's something that should drive the entire international order of things. But when it comes to the proven and interconnected threat of the armed American extreme right wing, we're still treating every attack by them like a surprise. We're still treating every one of those attackers like a lone wolf, regardless of how many letters we find between them, each of them while they're in jail, regardless of the places where we find them talking to each other online, regardless of the connections that they say exist between them, regardless of the tide of evidence that these networks exist and are operational. Why are we so willing to not be afraid of the threat of right-wing extremism in this country? Why is that? Should that change? Hold that thought.